That night was one of the first times I didn't worry because she was on foot.
What was the last thing she said?
See you later, Ma.
2 sleepless nights later, Joyce was found beaten to death, lying in this ditch in the woods behind the high school.
This was reality hit, and this was for real. And Joyce was dead, and it was homicide. And I had to tell her sister, your sister is dead and won't be ever coming home. And I can't make a Band-Aid that will fix this one.
The year was 1980, and the Pittsburgh Steelers had just become the first NFL franchise to win 4 Super Bowls, defeating the Los Angeles Rams in the 14th Super Bowl. Mount St. Helens had just erupted in Washington, and the world was preparing for the loss of music star John Lennon. As the sun began to set in the picturesque town of East Millinocket, Maine, nobody could have foreseen that a simple evening jog by a 16-year-old girl would ultimately lead to a heart-wrenching tragedy that would haunt the community for decades to come. When 16-year-old Joyce McLain went out for a run, her family did not think anything of it. But when Joyce never returned home, panic and fear quickly spread throughout the town. As residents got together in a desperate search to find her, they came to the sudden realization that a killer could be lurking among them. Welcome back to True Crime Expresso, where we explore solved and unsolved crimes and brooding mysteries from all corners of the planet. In today's video, we'll explore the tragic events surrounding Joyce McLain's tragic murder and the hunt for her killer. For decades, the question of who killed Joyce cast a dark cloud over East Millinocket. But just as people were beginning to accept that Joyce's murder might never be solved, a breakthrough threatened to crack the case wide open. It was a case that had gone completely cold. With no leads or clues in sight, the cold case of Joyce McLain left investigators stumped, and the case dwindled to a crawl. Until a breakthrough led detectives right to the perpetrator. During the 1980s, East Millinocket was a small town of just over 2,000 residents, located in the northern part of the state. The town was built around the Great Northern Paper Company mill, which was the main employer for many of the residents there. Despite the hard work and long hours required to work in the mill, the people of East Millinocket were known for their friendly nature and tight-knit community. It was a place where families felt safe enough to let their children roam free, play in the parks unsupervised, and keep their doors unlocked. Joyce Marie McLain was born in 1963 in East Millinocket, Maine, to parents Pam and Michael McLain. Her little sister Wendy was born just 19 months later. From an early age, Joyce showed exceptional talent and skill. She excelled at everything she put her mind to and developed a passion for music. Joyce loved playing her saxophone and would later play in the school band, improvising solos and composing music of her own. According to her mother, Joyce could pick up any instrument and learn it by ear. Joyce McLain was a girl with boundless energy and ambition. Despite being an honor student and a member of the student council, she still found time to pursue her passion for the arts as a member of the thespian troupe. But Joyce's talents didn't stop at academics. She was also a gifted athlete, participating in soccer, tennis, basketball, and cheerleading. Even in her free time, Joyce was always on the go, babysitting and teaching piano lessons. Her drive and determination were truly remarkable for someone only 16 years of age, and it was clear to those that knew her that Joyce had a bright future ahead of her. During the summer of 1980, Joyce was about to start her year as a junior at Schenck High School. She had recently obtained her driver's license and was planning on having a beach party for her upcoming 17th birthday. Joyce always had her sights set on the future, and after graduation had planned to go to college. Those dreams and aspirations would come to an abrupt and violent end that summer. On the evening of August 8, 1980, Joyce McLain had spent the day enjoying the company of her friends and swimming out on the lake. But as someone who was always on the go, she couldn't resist the urge to squeeze in one last activity before the day was over: an evening run. Although running wasn't her favorite activity or particularly enjoyable for her, as a dedicated athlete who participated in numerous sports, Joyce knew the importance of exercise, especially with the upcoming soccer season just on the horizon. Joyce's mother, Pam, recalls seeing her daughter in a pink terry cloth running suit as she sprinted out the front door at about 7:30 p.m., seeking the cooler temperatures of the evening. It was the last time Pam would ever see her daughter alive. The route she took would take about an hour, She would do a few laps on the road that went around her tiny town. When Joyce failed to return home that night, Pam knew that something was amiss. The teenager was always responsible, and it was extremely unlikely for her to stay out too late, let alone never come home at all. The hours that followed Joyce's disappearance were nothing short of excruciating for her loved ones, as they frantically searched around town for any sign of the missing teen. Local law enforcement officials and countless volunteers joined forces, scouring the surrounding areas in a desperate effort to find her. As the night wore on, it became increasingly clear that Joyce was nowhere to be found. As the clock hit midnight, police had completely ruled out the possibility that Joyce may have gone out with friends. All her friends she knew were at home and later joined in the search. The search for Joyce would come to a tragic end 2 days after her disappearance on August 10, 1980, when Peter Larley, one of the volunteers searching for Joyce, found her lifeless body in the woods behind the high school. "I saw Joyce," Peter Larley said. "She wasn't moving. Her body, I think, had been beaten. I knew that she wasn't alive. I started screaming her name. After that, I turned and ran home and called the police." Joyce was found partially clothed, with a part of her skull caved in, indicating blunt force trauma. Her hands were tied behind her back with a blue cloth. Because of the torrential rains the night before, most of the evidence, forensic or otherwise, seemed to have washed away. Medical analysts confirmed that her death occurred on the evening she disappeared. Although she was partially clothed, it was concluded that Joyce had not been sexually assaulted. The case that 2 days ago was a disappearance had now just turned into a homicide. News about the gruesome crime quickly spread through the town like wildfire. This tiny town in the middle of nowhere had never encountered a murder. Investigators learned that Joyce had been last seen jogging towards the soccer field. She had a route that took her out around town and behind Skank High School. The last time Joyce was seen, she was turning the corner, going down to the softball field and the soccer field where she usually ran several laps. Witnesses say she was spotted around 8 p.m. the evening she went missing. As investigators dove deeper into the tragic case, 2 main theories emerged. The first theory suggested that some locals had been drinking in the popular hangout field where Joyce was last seen and began harassing her. This group may have then forced Joyce into the nearby woods with the intention of committing a sexual assault. However, things quickly took a deadly turn, and Joyce never made it out alive. Another theory suggested that 1 or more workers from the local paper mill, who were not residents of East Millinocket, may have been responsible for Joyce's murder. This theory gained traction as the mill had recently hired 300 new laborers, and the community had started to notice an increase in crime. Despite the various theories and speculations surrounding Joyce McLain's murder, investigators working on the case were unable to find any conclusive evidence to support any of them. The case hit a wall as the lack of evidence made it nearly impossible to identify a suspect or determine a motive for the brutal crime. The community of East Millinocket was left feeling vulnerable and uneasy as the killer remained at large, with many residents locking their doors and windows at night, fearing for their own safety. Suddenly, children were no longer playing in the streets alone, and during Halloween, adults would stand on every street patrolling the neighborhood. A dark cloud bloomed over the town that wasn't there before Joyce's death. The town was changed by the tragedy, but no life was more affected by Joyce's murder than her family's. Pam McLain never wavered in her search for Joyce's killer and fought for years to get her daughter's name into the public eye. Over the years that followed, Joyce's case was featured on Unsolved Mysteries in 1989, 9 years after Joyce's murder. Investigators made sure to follow up on every tip that came in, but unfortunately, they all hit a dead end or didn't check out. Pam McLain had always held on to hope that her daughter's killer would be found, but after years of no progress, that hope began to fade. As for the investigators, they too had their suspicions on who could have been responsible, but without any concrete evidence, they were at a loss for how to move forward. But Pam was relentless in her pursuit of justice. For years, she had tried to have Joyce's body exhumed to find new evidence. This brought about a new set of challenges. Initially, authorities denied the mother's request for exhumation. They believed that in almost 3 decades, any evidence that could have once been present would not be preserved. Finally, in 2008, it was done so for a second autopsy, where new evidence was uncovered. Investigators did not reveal this newly found evidence, They only stated the case was immediately reopened. In 2009, law enforcement announced a prime suspect for the first time in 29 years. On the night Joyce was murdered, then 19-year-old Philip Fournier, known as Scott, was involved in a separate incident that nearly claimed his life. In the initial phase of the investigations, Scott was in a coma due to a traumatic brain injury, making it impossible for authorities to question him. But he remained on the list of possible suspects throughout the years. That night, Scott had broken into a local garage and stole their fuel truck, diving it straight through the garage door. He ended up colliding with a car a few miles away, completely flipping the truck. It took Scott 3 weeks to regain consciousness, and when police went to question him, he was little help as he couldn't remember much from that night. Investigators had good reason for their inquiry. Some witnesses had said they had seen Scott near the school around the time Joyce vanished. Witnesses stated he had a hard liquor bottle with him too. A few days before her death, Scott told his stepbrother that he had a crush on Joyce and later told his stepfather that he wanted to take up jogging, an activity that Joyce did frequently around town. Scott had repeatedly confessed to the crime several times. On one occasion, he cried to his mother and sister stating that he had killed Joyce. He told a local priest about the crime and also told a co-worker. Most of these confessions never made it to police until years later. On March 4, 2016, Philip Scott Fournier of East Millinocket was arrested and charged with Joyce's murder. The town was left stunned to find that the perpetrator had been living among them the entire time, but law enforcement had him on their radar for years. By the time he was arrested, Scott had several previous convictions on charges of possession of child pornography, burglary, and theft. He pleaded not guilty to the murder charge and asked for a trial by judge. His defense claimed that his confessions were unreliable due to the injuries he sustained from the truck crash. Instead, they pointed to other suspects in the case, including Peter Larley, the man who found Joyce's body, and men who Scott named in his confessions. But all of them had already been ruled out by police. He was questioned for a total of 27 times, each time changing his story. At first, he told investigators he killed Joyce by stabbing her several times, using a glass insulator from a rundown power line that was lying nearby. The girl's lifeless body was indeed found underneath a power line. Scott then stated he abused her, tied her hands, and fled the scene. The one thing that puzzled investigators about this story was Joyce had not been abused as medical examinators' tests reported. Beside this one discrepancy, this story was very close to the truth. In the following interrogations, he stated he had killed Joyce in the company of other men. Then he said he sat back and watched the men attack her. He then changed the story again and said the men forced him to participate in the attack. This obviously confused detectives. They had no hard evidence against him. 2 witnesses took part in helping bring the case to trial, a priest and a co-worker of Scott, who both heard him confess to the crime. The co-worker asked Scott how it was he got away with it after all these years. Scott replied that he had given investigators false information of other people's involvement to get them off his trail. Scott admitted to the priest that he had not abused Joyce because she was on her period, a fact that investigators knew after examining her body but was never released to the public. Scott could have never known such details unless he was there that day and committed the crime. In January 2018, 38 years after Joyce's brutal murder, Philip Scott Fournier's trial began. In the end, the jury sided with the prosecution and found him guilty of murder. He was sentenced to 45 years in prison. Though he has tried to appeal his conviction over the years, they have all been turned down or overruled. It had taken nearly 40 years, but justice was finally served, and Joyce's killer was brought to justice. For the first time since that fateful day in 1980, Joyce's family had found peace. Joyce McLain's murder was a tragedy that shook the small mill town of East Millinocket. Her death remained unsolved for over 3 decades, but through the persistence of family and law enforcement and advances in forensic technology, her killer was finally brought to justice. Although Joyce's life was cut tragically short, her memory lives on in those that knew and loved her. The mystery of Joyce's death was solved, but still, it serves as a warning of the dangers that can lurk, even in the most idyllic of small towns. Her family, friends, and the community have been left with a sense of closure and some semblance of peace, but also left with a lingering question. Who else might be hiding in the shadows? What were your thoughts on this case? Let us know below.